of the Earth, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Platform London, and Friends of the Earth Scotland. And together we're working to cut financial and political ties to the fossil fuel industry. And we are lucky enough to work with some incredible activists and groups across the UK who are doing amazing work. We had a huge action earlier this year. We had a big day of action in March. And we've got a picture here from West Yorkshire. There were actions all across the UK calling on councils to stop investing in fossil fuels. There have been a number of councils that have already made really important divestment commitments, including Cardiff and Islington and Waltham Forest. And we've just launched this very exciting new research that Rob has done an incredible amount of work on. He has spent over a year finding out exactly how much UK councils are currently investing in fossil fuels, and it was published just a few weeks ago. And Rob has discovered that councils are currently investing £16 billion in fossil fuel companies, the companies that are fueling the climate crisis. And we've got this really exciting new tool on the platform website where you can find out exactly how much your council is investing in fossil fuels. And I'll just pop up the link to that. And we're going to show you how to research your council's investments in the fossil fuel industry. So here we go. We've got an example that we're going to show from Bradford Council, and this is the West Yorkshire Pension Fund. And Rob, would you mind chatting us through how we can use this tool to find out how much our councils are investing in fossil fuels?
Sure, I can do that. I'm just going to post a link in the chat. So you can go onto this website, and what you will be able to see is a link to an interactive map that you can click on and find your council. And then when you go on it, you get to this. So we've chosen West Yorkshire just randomly, though I know we have a councillor in Bradford, so welcome. And then you can scroll down through this and see more information about what your fund invests in. So first we have how much it invests in fossil fuels and how that compares to other pension funds across the UK that are local government. If you scroll down for me, Sally, I'm going to race through this because it's not the topic of tonight's call, but it might be interesting nonetheless. You can then find some information about what type of investment these assets are, what assets are the fossil fuel ones. If you scroll down again, please, Sally. Okay, you can then find out in various levels of detail for West Yorkshire, not so much, who the asset managers are and what proportion is in oil and gas versus coal. If you keep scrolling down, please. You can then get to what I find the most exciting part of the project, which is a visualization about where in the world those fossil fuels are invested, including these orange dots, which are outlinks to what we refer to as reputational risk projects, and find out more about those pensions, fund investments in fossil fuels. If you scroll down, please, to the final section, Sally, which is just some outlinks of what you can do about it, because finding out what your fund invests in is one thing, but we want you to do something about it, whether that's campaigning on it, setting new policy about it, passing council motions in your trade union supporting the end of that investment, or actually removing that investment yourselves if you sit on a pension fund committee. However, that is not the subject of tonight's call. So Sally, I'm going to ask you to stop screen sharing so that we can get into the main event. We just thought it would be useful to spend some time today just noting and pointing out that resource. The topic of tonight's event, as you all know, is risky business and bad advice. Pensions use models that drastically understate the impact of climate change on the economy. We're here tonight to talk about what that means and what we can do about it. And we're joined by Professor Steve Keane, by Joel Benjamin from Carbon Tracker, and by Stephen Smellie from Unison. Before we get underway and I pass to Steve to give us an introduction to this groundbreaking new research, I'm going to first just invite Andrew to say a few words of welcome from Unison. Andrew, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for that. So I am Andrew Dobby, and I am Unison's National Officer for Capital Stewardship, which means that I'm particularly interested in what use is made of our members' money when it's placed in pension funds. When I heard about this important research that Professor Keane had done, I was very keen to take the opportunity to try to enable you Unison representatives on boards and committees, and Unison activists active in this area to find out more about this important work. So that was the reason why Rob and I discussed and agreed that it would be a good idea to put this on. I know that the invitation has gone wider, and I'm really pleased about that, because this is an ecumenical thing. We don't know less because other people know more. So let's all join in today. Let's find out more about this important work. Those of you who have fiduciary duties, have a think about the new information that you're receiving. Have a think about what questions you want to ask of your own committee and board structures where you are. And this is part of a mission of finding out more about what our pension fund monies are invested in, what is the impact of those pension fund monies as a result, and what investment strategies should you probably be pursuing. So I'd encourage you all, and the fact that you've turned up today means that you're already doing this. Find out about this work, hear what the professor has to say, read through the report and find out more about it, and then think about what you want to do the same or differently in the future. So with that, I will pass on to the professor, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you so much for coming, Professor, to help our activists learn more about this, and I'm looking forward to a really exciting session today. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm very pleased to be invited to speak on this issue. I think this is, without doubt, the most important issue facing humanity. That is, of course, climate change is in general, but the extent to which we're unprepared for what we're going to experience and unprepared for how soon it's going to happen is partially due to the fossil fuel companies, which, of course, want to delay and want to prevent action to stop us using fossil fuels. So you can regard them as fighting the war against action on climate change. But the arms dealers in the war against climate change are economists. And they didn't have to be paid to do this. They've done it because this is their belief about capitalism, that it can hand any shock whatsoever. So climate change can't be a big deal. I wish I was being facetious, but frankly, I'm not. So this is the report, and this is just recently it's finally starting to get into the media. This is through a campaigning journalist called Christopher Ketchum in a online magazine called The Intercept. But that has also led to a number of other publications, the most important one being down the bottom, which is by Reuters. So I'd recommend taking a look at that and sharing that as widely as possible. Most people won't take the level of detail I'm going to give you tonight. That is a reasonably good summary of what I'll be showing you. So in a nutshell, what's been happening for all of you people is having fiduciary duties. You've been relying upon it, whether you know it or not, on estimates economists have made of the damages from climate change. And that's either directly, in the case if you've actually been advised by economists, or if you have used consultants like Mercer who then do the research for you. That's using research in a very broad sense. Now, this has led to as comments like this from my own superannuation fund in Australia, which I found quite hilarious in a very depressing way, is that they did a worst case scenario of 4.3 degrees of warming by 2100 and told me that was going to be an acceptable risk to my portfolio. Now, I know from living with climate scientists that this is actually the level we get to. My portfolio, if I'm lucky, will consist of sticks and stones and maybe a bow and arrow if I'm really quite innovative. And I'll be hunting, I'll be the hunter as much as the hunt head in a situation like that. It's simply insane to imagine that we could survive a temperature rise like that. Now, these numbers have been made up, and I use that word the same way your children will make up an excuse for why there's dirt in the bathroom and it's not their fault, okay? They have made up numbers by simply not understanding what climate change means. It took me a long time to realize that, to accept it, but you'll see why I believe this. Now, when you talk to scientists and you read scientific papers, you'll find them describing 4.3 degrees of warming as lying between catastrophic and existential, okay? Whereas the economists are telling us that we're going to get a few percent damages. That's what the UNICEF is effectively reflecting over there. So if we're going to survive, and I'm going to be very frank, it is a matter of survival. It's not just whether you get a decent pension in your retirement, it's whether your retirement gets cut short by famines, wet bulb catastrophes, outrageous storms, etc., etc. That's the feature we face. So we really have to focus on reducing carbon dioxide as fast as possible. And the economists have been the major obstruction, along with the fossil fuel companies, for achieving that. Now, to give you an idea, I'm sure you're thinking, I know some of my own colleagues thought, oh, Steve's exaggerating. if they first hear me saying stuff like that, then they read the papers that I'm commenting on. So you'll find stuff, and I'm going to contrast economists versus scientists here. This is Nordhaus. The damage equation says damage is 2.1% at 3 degrees of warming and 8.5% of income at 6 degrees of warming. Okay. So 6 degrees of warming will reduce future GDP by 8.5% compared to what it would have been in the complete absence of climate change, which means rather than being, say, 5 times what it is today, it'll be 4.5 times what it is today. And you can find Bjorn Lomborg quoting this sort of nonsense on Twitter and so-called refereed papers. And here's the scientists. More than 1.5 is dangerous, more than 3 is catastrophic, and more than 5 is existential. That's the world we face. Now, again, you think, don't the economists read the scientists? Well, here is Nordhaus saying there's been a very interesting study of tipping points by Lenton and colleagues, and they found, their review finds no critical tipping elements with a time horizon of less than 300 years until global temperatures have risen by at least 3 degrees Celsius. Well, that's all right then. Nothing to worry about unless you read Lenton and colleagues 2008. And this is their conclusion. A variety of tipping elements could reach their critical point within this century. The greatest threats being the Arctic and Greenland ice sheet. And at least 5 more could also surprise us. Now, believe it or not, the statement on the left by Nordhaus is supposed to be a summary of the paper on the right by Lenton and friends. Any student who gave me that as a summary, I would fail them. I'd probably kick them out of the course. This guy got a Nobel Prize. Again, one little contrast here. This is on tipping points now. They finally put a paper out on tipping points last year or 2 years ago. 6 degrees of warming, tipping points will add an additional 1.4% of damages. And I got some colleagues together, including Tim Lenton and a couple of other scientists, to talk about this and say, it's just ridiculous. It's absurd to say that losing these 8 elements of the climate would only reduce GDP by 1.4%. Just insane. Now, and the scientists themselves, some of them have been aware, particularly Tim Lenton, has been aware of this for some time. He wrote this a decade ago, saying there's a huge gulf. But I don't think scientists are just starting to realise that economists are the main reason why policymakers haven't taken the advice of climate scientists seriously. What they've done to produce these numbers, I call them imaginary numbers, because they really have been totally made up. So the first thing they did is what they call the enumerative method. And when you read this the first time, it doesn't look so bad. They take damage estimates from climate scientists and put a price on them and say that's going to be the damage to GDP. Then you take a look at how they do that. And this is Nordhaus in 1991, saying that 3% of the American economy is exposed to climate change, 10% moderately exposed, and 87% occurs in sectors that are negligibly affected by climate change. He says for the bulk of the economy, manufacturing, notice the next one, mining, utilities, finance, trade, wholesale and retail trade, most services, difficult to find major direct impacts over the next 50 to 75 years. So this is what he had as ones which are going to be severely affected, farms basically and forests. And these are the negligible effects, all of manufacturing and mining, all of transportation, finance, insurance, and real estate that's not coastal. It's just childish. This is somebody who is mistaking climate for the weather. And I can see why people will do this if they are amateurs, but not if they're professionals, because even the professionals provide a definition that says effectively the climate is the average over time of the weather. But that obscures the structural change that climate change will cause. So I'm just going to take one example here. There are 3 circulation cells that give us the equatorial region, the temperate zone, and then the polar zone. And they're rising and falling air at each of those degrees latitude. Now, scientists say one of the possible effects of climate change, not one of their considering immediately, though there are some scientists say it could happen this century, is that would break down from 3 cells into 1 cell, which would mean that the rain would be falling in the equator regularly, at the poles regularly, and in between only during catastrophic downpours. We wouldn't be able to survive that change. That's the sort of thing that climate change is about. And the other one, the elements that are going to amplify the feedbacks, things like the loss of the Arctic. We're going to lose the Arctic. That is almost guaranteed. Actually, it is guaranteed now. So that's one thing they've done. They've simply said anything under a roof is going to be protected from climate change. The only thing those industries have in common is they occur under cover, except for mining, and later on he implemented that to underground mining. If you're wondering how did this person get a PhD, let alone a Nobel Prize, you're getting some feeling for how bad economics is as a discipline. Now, the other way they've done is they say we're going to assume that what we get in terms of the relationship between temperature and GDP across a country today, we're going to use that as a proxy for what's going to happen through climate change. So they're using a space as a proxy for time, in other words. And this is Richard Toll, who's probably the most offensive of this lot of idiot savants that do this work. So he said at one stage 10K, which is 10 degrees Celsius, that's 10 Kelvin, is less than the temperature difference between Alaska and Maryland, and they're equally wealthy. And he says climate is not a primary driver of income. Now, a climate scientist bumped into the conversation and said, look, this idea that climate change, just like adding 10 degrees everywhere, is really, really silly. And that comes Toll telling off a meteorologist that he doesn't know what he's talking about. So people live in very different climates. And he then said at the bottom, if a relationship does not hold for climate variations across space, you cannot confidently assert that it holds through time. That sounds clever. Okay, it's absolutely stupid, but it sounds clever. And he gets away with it. He's the editor of a leading journal, the Journal of Energy Economics. Now, I'm going to show you what they actually did. As a proxy example. It just took me about a half an hour. The dots are combinations of temperature deviations from average and income deviation from the average for the 40, I think it's 48, I think it is, 48 contiguous continental American states. And you can see it's a pretty wide scatter. You wouldn't want to use this you wouldn't want to use the information to try to solve a trivia night. You know, here's the temperature deviation for this state. Which one is it? You would have no idea. Okay, but that's you can fit a weak quadratic to it, which I've done there. And in fact, my regression coefficient, which is the dark line here, is more extreme than Nordhaus put in the second last version of his model. And to this is half an hour's work. I'm waiting for my Nobel Prize in the post. Now, the fatal weakness with this is that, first of all, despite Toll's attempt to be clever, space is not a proxy for time. But even more importantly, the incomes of those states depend upon their capacity to trade with other states and with other parts of the world. The reason you can survive in North Dakota or survive in Florida or survive in Alaska is you're selling stuff to the rest of the world. So cold states today can survive by trading with warm and temperate states. But a future hot Earth cannot trade with a current cold Earth. So what they should have done, and this is simply statistical procedures, if they were being honest about their data, they should have said, well, we need to amend this so we only look at goods that are produced by North Dakota and consumed in North Dakota, and what could be the total output if that's all they did versus Florida and so on. You would have got a much steeper curve and said much more serious damages. But they didn't even try to do that. Next, what they'll do is they'll take data that applies to our current situation, and they'll then extrapolate that forward through what's going to be a period of massive tipping points. So they have a database from 1960 to 2014, and that shows you change in temperature over time and GDP and change in GDP. They then did a correlation exercise on that relationship, and then so that's the effect. 1/100th of a degree change causes a 0.5% change in GDP the next year. And they then simply extrapolated that forward from where we are at the moment, which at that stage might be about 1 degree of warming, out to when it's going to be 4. You can see the shaded area on the chart there. That's what they extrapolated with supposed error bands. That's simple linear extrapolation. But that only makes sense if there's no structural change to the climate in the next 80 years. Which begs the question, do you know what climate change is? They don't. Down here, we have the most extreme prediction made by any groups of economists, 23% fall in future GDP. This paper gets quoted, what about Burke? I have been being asked. This is about Burke. They say that we found overall productivity will decline, but they then say here if future adaptation mimics past adaptation. In other words, if the structure of the climate doesn't change. This is what climate change is about, you idiot. And I really am believe the word idiot is being polite. And then what they've done is they've used quadratics. Now, quadratics means y equals x squared. It's the shape of a parabola. It's very smooth. Okay. If you want to do a ride at this amusement park, a parabola is quite a safe ride for you to go on. And this has been criticised for about 1.5, 2 decades now. And this is one of the most strong criticisms from in a professional economist, saying it's made up out of thin air. Okay. There's no reason for it. And even if it did fit, you wouldn't know what the parameters are. But they continue, despite this criticism, water off a duck's back, they keep on saying exactly the same stuff. So this is in 2021, quadratic damages. This is the paper on tipping points, quadratic extrapolation. It's just ludicrous. So what I did in the report, I said, well, let's actually use real data, not numbers you idiots have made up. Use real data, and then let's extrapolate that forward using what you assume, which is nonsense, which is a quadratic, but also throwing in a exponential and a logistic, which is the S-shaped curve you'll see for penetration of goods into a marketplace. So that's the database. The bars are the number of events of a particular type. The lines are the monetary value of that. This is maintained by the American government. And when you fit these three functions to it within the data we currently have, you really can't tell the functions apart. You're indistinguishable. So therefore, the quadratic is a good approximation to an exponential or a logistic across the range of current data. What happens when you extrapolate it forward? Now, what you're being told as fiduciaries is that this is what we're going to be facing for climate change. This is more likely. And it's likely to happen in your lifetimes. Don't think it's about your kids. This is about you too. Why on earth have economists produced this garbage? Largely it's because they have an ideological attitude that capitalism is the best possible social system, and they therefore rail against anything which might imply constraints on capitalism. And because they're used to making ludicrous assumptions in their courses and their own papers, it makes, again, water off a duck's back to make ludicrous assumptions about the physical world. And my problem is, I'm sorry, this isn't just an exercise for convincing your students about your theory of monopoly control. This could destroy capitalism. Your attempt to preserve capitalism could destroy it and destroy all of our futures. And it isn't, funnily enough, I mean, I'm very well known as a critic of mainstream economics. I have a book called Debunking Economics, which is quite famous in the non-orthodox camp and quite famous in the orthodox too, because they hate me. I'm very happy to be hated by people who make mistakes like this. But all this stuff was done by neoclassical economists. A couple of scientists and statisticians have been involved as well, the same sort of way you get nutcase scientists turning up and doing bad work on climate change. But there's nothing actually neoclassical in what they've done. I haven't even spoken about the model that they have beneath this. It's just their numerical assumptions. And as this is again Pindick saying, the damage functions are completely ad hoc. No theoretical or empirical justification. And the models tell us nothing about catastrophic climate change. And yet everybody's accepted because they're the experts on economics, they're the experts on the economics of climate change, and we've swallowed their advice to the stage where we're a bit like passengers on the Titanic, 500 metres from the iceberg. Okay. So I think they should be removed from the debate. I want to get them kicked out. There's 2,216 of them have been identified. I want them gone. They shouldn't be involved in advice at all. And we need to get scientists and regulators working with responsible, non-neoclassical economists. There are some irresponsible ones, but very, very fewer than you get nutcases in neoclassical economics. We've got to get rid of that work. Now, we have two choices. One is we change, we divest, we give some sort of warning. The other is we don't. We don't look up and we let nature take its course. And this is where we'll end up. And as I said, it's probably in your lifetimes. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Steve, as ever, for a veritable tour de force of the grave gap between what scientists are saying and what economists are saying. I'm going to move immediately to our next speaker, and we're delighted to be joined by Joel Benjamin, and Joel is going to do some of the work of translating that into a bit of a local government audience. Joel, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. So, yeah, Steve's just given us, I guess, a very robust critique of the underlying economics to, understanding kind of how this science is being mistranslated by investment consultants. And I think where Carbon Tracker came into this work about 12 months ago, when we first came up with the idea of approaching Steve to do this report, was the understanding that there's a handful of investment consultants, firms like Mercer, Aon, that have got quite a large market share and are quite influential, but are not especially well known outside of a very niche part of the financial landscape. And so what we wanted to really focus on was the way in which the economist advice was being disseminated into financial markets by these consultants. And so what we did in conjunction with Steve was send FOI requests to all of the LGPS pension funds across the UK to start to get an impression of how this economist advice is being used to advise the local pension schemes about how to manage their money. Because what we'd heard from our own conversations with committee members, from activists at local schemes that were trying to get their funds to divest, was oftentimes they were having quite positive conversations with committee members, in some cases finance officers, but one of the barriers which kept coming back as to why the fund wasn't taking more action to decarbonize was because of the advice they were receiving from the investment consultants. And a lot of the advice from the consultants, like Mercer, is essentially saying this problem is going to be primarily solved by financial markets. Do not divest from fossil fuels. Continue engaging, despite the fact in many cases engagement has seen little or no progress. And so we kind of end up being, I guess, trapped in this cycle of very little action, but some of the kind of alternative options being sort of closed off to us. So in terms of why this report, I think, is particularly important for the local government sector, I mean, obviously the LGPS is one of the largest pension funds in the UK, so approaching £400 billion of assets under management. So a very big financial force in its own right. There's obviously a long-established democratic link, given these funds are managed by local authorities. Many of the councillors sitting on committees have other roles, other portfolios. They might be, for example, also responsible for things like housing, transport, infrastructure. So what information is provided to the committee of the pension fund might also make its way into other parts of the council and, let's say, pollute decisions that are made elsewhere. And so I guess our concern with Carbon Tracker was that the urgency of the need to act and the need to decarbonize these funds was just not coming through in the literature that the funds are receiving from the consultants. And we've seen examples from the likes of Shropshire where the advice the fund was getting was that the projected losses from a 1.5C aligned scenario would be greater over the next 5 years than if we had a failed transition with 3 or 4 degrees warming in 20 or 30 years' time. And so I think what's basically happening is that the urgency which we're required to decarbonize these funds, to make decisions today to exclude fossil fuels from our portfolios, to invest in clean energy of the future, the urgency is just not being translated by the advisors. And so Steve's report has been, I think, a really useful intervention just to help us kind of understand why some of those kind of roadblocks are there. And I think the key part of today's conversation is then, armed with this knowledge from Steve, what can be done about it? What questions can be asked of both the consultants and the people making decisions about how this money is invested? How can we do things differently to give these funds a push? Because let's not forget, many of these LGPS funds have set net zero targets vastly in advance of what the UK government's doing. So, I see local councils and LGPS funds with 2030, 2035, 2040 net zero targets. So the policy framework is there for a much more rapid decarbonisation, but it's the rate of change in the investments which has been too slow in many cases. And so I think the advice these investment consultants are giving is a key part of that. And at Carbon Tracker, we're going to be working over the next 12 months, looking at ways we can put pressure on the consultants to change the inputs, economic inputs to their models so that they better reflect the underlying climate science. And if they refuse to do that, to start to look at new modeling approaches which better reflect the science and the urgency to act. So I'll leave things there, and I'm sure there'll be time for questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Joel. Really appreciate that. I'm going to pass immediately so that we have as much time as possible for questions at the end to Stephen from Unison. Over to you, Stephen, and feel free to introduce yourself at the start because you can probably do it better than I can. So I'll leave you to do it.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, my name's Stephen Smellie. I'm a member of Unison's National Executive Council. You'll probably tell from the accent, I'm from Scotland, and in South Lanarkshire specifically, and I'm a member of the Strathclyde Pension Fund. I also sit on the Scottish Local Government Scheme Advisory Board. At these events, I always declare self-interest and point out that I am a member of the pension fund, and the first duty of anyone sitting on a pension fund is to look after my pension, because I'm getting to that stage where I will be wanting to access it pretty soon, and I hope to be drawing it for a good few number of years. So, you know, first things first, look after my pension fund. And we talk about this in the context of Unison has something like 800,000 members working in local government in the UK, and most of them will be members of the pension fund. The vast majority will be members of the pension fund. So it's a really important issue for us when we sit down to talk about pensions. This is an immediate issue for many of us, and for some of our younger members, obviously, it's more of a long-term issue. So there's important issues in the short term, there's issues in the longer term that are really important for us. And as a trade union, our job is to look after the interests of our members, both immediately, but also in the long term. So that's why we talk about finance for local government, because we recognise that in years to come, we want public services to still exist, so the jobs are still there for our members and our members in the future and their families and so on and so forth. So we have a direct personal selfish interest in this kind of issue. And the first thing that anyone who goes on to a pension committee or a pension board is told or sometimes feels like lectured is about your fiduciary duty. You're not here to represent Unison. You're not here to represent anyone else. You're here to represent, you've got a fiduciary duty. But we should always remember that fiduciary duty is to the pension members. It's about protecting the rights and the future of those members, my future and the future of those 800,000 Unison members. And so when we have these discussions about fiduciary duty, some people talk about that as if, well, that's a duty to the fund, so that we maximise the income to the fund, so that we get a bigger and bigger fund. But no, I would argue, and we argue strongly in Unison, it's about a duty to the pension fund members, the people who pay into it, and the people who draw the benefits from it when they retire. And that, therefore, isn't just about the immediate investment returns. It's about the future of those investments and whether they will still be there. And I'm quite optimistic, in 20 or 30 years when I'm still drawing my pension, hoping I'll still be there to do that. So we have to look at that in that sense. So when we talk about fiduciary duty, we have to take on board what is the longer term impact going to be, not just on the fund, but on the environment in which we live in. And it's really important that pension funds get better at recognising the impact that their activities have on carbon production and carbon reduction, because they're going to very soon have to report on it. So they'll be exposed to that accountability about whether what they're doing actually is helping to address the problem or actually continuing to make it worse. I think we have to accept that over many, many years, and the figures that were quoted earlier on about the billions of pounds that remain invested in fossil fuel, it demonstrates that we've actually been part of the problem. We have been helping with others to create the problem. And ultimately what we have to recognise is, there are no jobs on a dead planet, but there will be no pensions either on a dead planet, and therefore we have that. I was interested to see a report the other day came through from the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and the University of Exeter. I think it's called the Emperor's New Climate Scenarios, and it touches on similar ground about how some of the bad advice that what Steve referred to as the arms dealers, the economists, are given to what that bad advice leading to. And it talks about, it makes the point about tipping points. Now, those of us who have studied the impact of climate change recognise that when they talk about tipping points, there comes a certain point where something significant will happen, whether that's the Greenland ice sheet melting or the tundra melting, that will then unleash a whole series of events and impacts which will not be able to be reversed. It doesn't matter how many times you recycle or reduce or whatever. If the tundra melts, then it's a game changer, and so on and so forth. What they talk about in this report is that recognising that means that you have to actually start thinking of how do we prevent that. And they talk about there being economic and financial tipping points, positive tipping points, that if we just apply the correct kind of advice and a correct understanding, listen to the scientists, as Steve said, but also listen to other economists who actually are able to interpret the science more effectively, then we could actually produce a greater movement towards investment in activities which are part of reducing the carbon use and investing in a better future and a more secure future for the environment, but also for my pension in years to come. But I think the other part about that, I think it does seem to me, and I'm no economist and I'm no scientist either, as I think invest. But there comes a point when there comes an economic or financial tipping point where the whole thing starts to implode. And this is the point at Unison, when we adopted the policy of support for divestment a number of years ago, we recognised that if we continue to invest all those billions of pounds into carbon, fossil fuel companies, there will come a point, if the world does what it should do, where all those investments will fairly quickly become worthless. They'll become much less valuable, and suddenly my pension is under threat. So I think there's an issue there about various understanding the environmental and economic and financial tipping points that we are confronted. And essentially, I suppose in some respects we're talking about the need for a just transition for pension funds, because I want my pension funds, as I say, to be secure. That means we need to transition away from the investments which are damaging the environment and damaging my future pensions prospects. And we don't really have to look very far. And Steve said that this is going to affect us, and that's a really, really important point, because when a number of years ago, when I started getting more interested in this, I talked about it, and other people talked about it. This is for our grandchildren. It's not for our grandchildren at all. You can see the effects today of what is happening with climate change. I mean, we've just in Scotland enjoyed the recent storm. I can't remember the name of it because all these names come along, and we've seen the damage which was done to ports and harbours and other areas. Our infrastructure just was not up to the storm damage which we had we suffered. That is having a huge impact then on the finances of the local authorities, who then have to step in to repair that infrastructure. It's having an impact on the kind of the nature of our jobs, the impact it has on workers who are having to. I come from a social work background. We had social workers in Angus, for example, having to work through the night to rescue people from older people and other people from their homes because they were flooded, and to get them into care overnight because of that. And that's just social workers. All the other people, the environmental people, the roads workers, the grounds workers, all these other people who were out in that kind of terrible weather trying to recover. And of course, they then continue to try to fix the problems before the next storm comes along. So those impacts are happening now. And if you multiply that by 10, 20, 100 times, because that's what the climate scientists say is going to happen, then you can see a complete transformation of the kind of services that Unison members are currently providing, and the quality of their lives that they will be able to enjoy today and into the future years of their pension. So it's really important that we, as a trade union, but we as a wider societal movement, recognise that we really need to get the people who are making decisions and giving advice to our pension fund managers, as Steve says, get some of them out off the table that shouldn't be listened to, and get the right kind of advice and get the kind of investments that will serve us well in the future. And that's really what this is about. This is about my pension. It's about the pension of all my 800,000 colleagues in local government and the benefit of society as a whole. So Unison are fully behind the divestment campaign, and it's getting more urgent every time we discuss it. It's more urgent than the last thing, because every report, the latest report that we're just here to talk about, just emphasises, more and more again. And every time you come along, you think something has to be done, and we have to do it quickly, because we are approaching those kind of tipping points that it may well be too late for me and my pension and everything else. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And to all of our speakers, thank you for joining us and taking the time to do so this evening. I have pulled some of the questions that have been placed in the chat. I'm now going to ask anybody to, if they have any questions, to raise their hand, either actually or using the chat function, the button that you can do that with, so that we can go to some of those before. And if you don't have any, I will go to some of the ones that haven't been answered already in the chat. So I have one hand up here. Let me find where it is. Or can I actually see it? That's another question.
It's Councillor Withington.
Okay, Councillor Withington, go for it.
Hi, thanks. I did put the question in the chat, but I thought I'd ask directly. I've looked at the figures you produce for the percentage of local councils investing in fossil fuels, and I've noticed that Essex County Council investments have increased from 1.94 to 2.6%. Does this represent just an increase in share value of the fossil fuel companies in the immediate past, or have they actually been putting more funds into fossil fuels, which they promised they wouldn't?
It represents the fact that comparative to the last time we took these readings, essentially, that fossil fuels will be more a part of their portfolio than they were before. That's probably more reflective, to give some credit to Essex, that the point of comparison was a poor one, not through any fault of our own, in the last time we did this report was March 2020, and as such, as a comparison, it's not really a good one, because there were some things happening in March 2020. So I think it's preferable to simply direct the current figures rather than the comparison to previous figures, because it doesn't really work as a comparison point, I would say. Because we have the company of some excellent expert speakers that we don't always have access to, I'm going to suggest that we try to move questions, and really welcome the questions, Stuart, but I'll be in direct communication over email, so that if we have more questions directly about one council pension fund's investment in fossil fuels, we'll try to take those to email, and more questions directly for our other panelists would be very welcome. I'm going to go to, I've got Neil here up on my screen, and then I'll go to Sydney.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we've got a pension divestment motion going through to our district council, who are part of Derbyshire County Council. And I'm wondering if people actually know what is a really strong argument that moves people. Like, I can come up with numbers and I can blather on about how we're running out of time, but if someone could tell me what it was that really helped them in the past make the argument and to shift people's vote, I'd be really interested to know that.
Thank you so much for your question, Neil. Are you if I'm going to follow up with you in the chat, unless any of our speakers have anything specific to say on that, I'm going to suggest that we move that question to the email forum that we have for fossil fuel divestment campaigners, in part because we have 58 people here tonight, and we have about 450 people on that email chain. and it received very regular communication. So I sense that the granularity of response will be far greater on that email chain than it will be here tonight, unless any of our speakers have anything they would like to respond to. Again, questions more specifically for the audience, that the speakers that we have limited time with tonight would be very welcome. Sydney, I'm going to go to you, and then I have some questions in the chat that I will ask.
Thanks. I wanted to ask Steve Keane whether this knowledge is liable to be better known as part of COP28, or whether it's going to be suppressed by the powers that be in COP28.
It'll be totally ignored. Just to give you an example of that, I was sent a report by another group of consultants, or the summary of it, from a LinkedIn report, where they said that the problem with my report was I didn't use the latest version of Nordhaus's model. And in other words, they're saying, oh, you know, sloppy research. Pardon me, I could use some very Australian expressions, what I think about that argument. It's nonsense. So what is going to happen? They'll fob off. So Mercer said we didn't use the latest version of their report, but they made every effort to stop us getting a copy of their report, and then criticise us for not looking at it. These people will dissemble. They'll avoid talking about it, and we won't get anything really big about this report until it gets into the media in a very big way. Thank God for the Reuters article, but also the Guardians, the Times. They need to be writing up about it as well. And frankly, we need a catastrophe that scares the shit out of people, because it's far too late for us to avoid this by taking evasive action. We're going to hit the iceberg, the metaphorical iceberg. It's a question of, you know, what part of the ship gets hit. And then when we see something like Kim Stanley Robinson had 25 million people dying in one day of a heat event, or we have what some scientists talk about, a global famine that'll knock off a few 100 million people over a year. And they have to be white people to some extent too, to be taken seriously. I think until then, this won't be taken forward. So please do whatever you can to get this into the media and get this to be taken attention of it, because otherwise they'll just ignore us and dissemble and waffle.
Going back to COP28, I put in the chat a link to an expose of an oil cartel and how they're trying to include. So that sort of thing really should surface there.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks so much, Steve and Sydney, for that question. I'm going to move to some questions from the chat now. Again, if you have further questions that come to you, feel free to post them in. We have about 15 more minutes, so we've got a bit of time. We're okay. I'm going to go to a question more explicitly for Stephen at Unison. Does Unison have an approach for creating a dialogue with Unison reps on pension boards who are not yet pushing for divestment by 2030? And actually, while I'm at it, I'm going to add a question to that, because it's also more Unison related, from Pauline on, I read that the government is threatening to unlock 10% of LGPS funds. What can we do about this? And why aren't the unions reacting to this? I understand Andrew has responded to that in the chat, but we'll invite both of you to speak to either of those points.
Stephen, if it's okay with you, I'll start with the second question. If
Sure.
that's okay, yeah. So so the government has proposed that it have a more directive role in relation to local government pension fund investments, and has suggested that it should in guidance set out an expectation that there would be 10% of all LGPS investments going into private equity, and 5% of all LGPS investments in something which in some way supports levelling up, which is quite difficult to understand quite what they mean. We were strongly opposed to that. Nevertheless, they've announced that it's their intention to proceed with issuing this guidance. We'll be looking closely at whether this guidance is actually lawful, because there is the ability of the government to guide is set out in legislation, and it needs to be consistent with that. They've come a cropper on that previously when they tried to do that in relation to Palestine. So let's see how lawful this is. I would encourage all of you who are involved in the LGPS family, in whichever way, to continue to zealously guard your independence and your local democratic accountability for the decision making that you have over your fund. We don't want the government telling local government pension schemes what they should be investing in. That's inappropriate, wrong, and we need to stop it. So we'll be pushing back against it as hard as we can. In relation to the first question, How does Unison inform its network of activists and representatives on pension fund boards and committees? Of course, this is one of the ways in which we do it. So we have a number of our activists are present on this call. We also disseminate information when we get it. We recognise at the same time that those people who are taking fund or committee positions have fiduciary duty, and as a result are not cannot be guided by an organisation of which they're a member. They need to make sure that they themselves consider what their fiduciary duty is and execute that. So what we don't do is go around looking over people's shoulders and deciding which way they voted, because that's would be completely wrong and inappropriate. I'm not going to start doing that. But what we will do is continue to give people information, continue to give people the opportunity to find out more about important work like that, which Steve's doing and others are doing, and continue to give people information and enable them to work with each other, because we've got a network of people across 90 different funds. How do they talk to each other? How do they share information with each other? You as campaigners can also contribute to that process. So that's what we're doing essentially. But Stephen may want to add.
I think you've covered most of it, Andrew. Exactly that. We have within the union, we have a network of what we call green or environment reps, and we encourage them to be raising ideas and issues and actions within their branches across the country and engaging with our pension reps. So the two of them are coming together. So they're not separate. We encourage them at a local level to come together and also at a national level. So we've had a number of webinars, for example, where these kind of discussions take place. We also encourage them to link up with local divestment campaigns. So I first met Sally, for example, when Sally was part of the Strathclyde divest, and we were talking about how can the union work with local activists in terms of raising these issues within the pension committees. So that's what we do. We try and, just as Andrew said, we try and give people information, encourage them to understand that information and work out how to do it, because it's not even just as easy as giving them the information and getting them to understand it. Anyone who sits on a pension board knows they come up against exactly the kind of barriers that people have talked about. Oh, we can't do that, we can't do this, the advice is such and such. I see one of the points in the chat was that, we've been told that the cost, but I think it's £50 million to divest. That's just rubbish. There are lots of alternative investments. We're not saying rip up the pension fund, pull them out and we'll all have to suffer. We're saying there are alternative investments, and you just really need to get engaged with that. So part of the job we have in Unison, exactly as Andrew said, we can't tell our reps exactly what to do. They need to listen, and they need to understand the local circumstances and what their pension fund are invested in. But we need to give them examples of how they could argue for, how they could look for other ways to invest the money in. If that can be invested, for example, in more local investments, so there will be direct benefits to our members at a local level. That would be a win-win situation for us as members, but also for the funds as well. So that's what we try and do. And I would encourage any Unison members here who are either on one of the pension boards or in a local branch to just engage in that discussion and talk through those things with their colleagues.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I'm going to move to slightly sideways to follow up on David's question in the chat. Thank you for joining us, David. TPR, the pensions regulators, advised trustees to look at the climate change scenarios in light of these papers, including the paper from the Faculty of Actuaries. Do we know if any of the committees have actually taken notice? And I'm going to connect that, because I know we have some speakers that can speak to this as well. What are some of the compelling arguments that we can make to make them take it more seriously? And if you'd like to speak to divestment within that as well, in particular carbon tracker colleagues, feel free to do so. Addressed to anybody, feel free to take it on.
So Rob, just to add on that particular point, I think this question about sort of relative performance of fossil fuels against renewables is one that comes up quite a lot. I mean, firstly, just to make the obvious point, they're two very different systems. Fossil fuels, there's a lot of volatility, both in terms of market prices for the commodities. So I mean, we've seen a decade up to and including COVID and the Ukraine war, where fossil fuels vastly underperformed relative to clean energy. I've put in the chat here a couple of reports we've published. We'll look at this. Obviously, in the year and a half since COVID in Ukraine, we've had fossil fuel prices increase again, so they've performed much better relative to renewables. But we don't think that's going to be the case into the future. And there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that you can basically exclude fossil fuels from your portfolio with marginal to no impact on performance. So if funds, I think, are providing that sort of information, firstly ask them to provide it to you and the committee so that it can be scrutinized, look at who's providing it, is it credible? And there's a lot of information and advice out there which provides a sort of counter view to that. So happy to have a look at it, and I can put you in touch with a few of our researchers for more information.
Stuart, I'll go to you if your point is pertinent to this, or I'll move to our other questions.
It's a question for Professor Keane, really. I have spoken to various people who work in the financial markets, and they seem to have an event horizon of around about sort of 5 years. So if something is happening further away than that, as long as they've made their good profits before then, they really don't care. I was wondering if you had any advice on how we can persuade these people who are just finance driven to look at the bigger picture.
Steve, I think that was a question for you.
My connection dropped out for a moment there, so I missed part of how do we get people to take more seriously with the basic thrust. It's incredibly difficult, because if I actually said what I think is going to come our way, I would be classed as an alarmist. And the trouble is, the more people know about this, in terms of climate scientists, the more they're likely to be alarmists, because they have some idea of the type of effects which can come our way. So I think if you're going to suggest, you might better work by analogy to say, we didn't use cost-benefit analysis to decide whether we should fight the Germans or fight the Nazis. We're using entirely the wrong framework. This is not something where you want to maximize your returns. It's something where you want to exist on the other side of the event. So we're thinking about this, what is an existential issue, we're thinking about as if it's a way of costs and benefits. Otherwise, I think the unfortunate thing is the economists have won. They've been trivializing this since 1972. And by getting away with it 50 years, they've made any of the warnings that scientists have made get buried in the arguments that it's all going to be minor. And they have successfully typed anybody who says the sort of existential things can happen, or you're an alarmist. So I think we're really quite trapped. I think the only thing we can do is to spread around. I think spreading around the fact that work is so bad is a good start, because if you show that somebody got a Nobel Prize in economics assumed that a roof would protect you from climate change, there's something seriously wrong with economics and wrong with his analysis. So in that sense, the easiest thing to do is simply say, did you know Nordhaus said this? Do you know that this guy, the IPC economics, said this? And say, and then ridicule them. Otherwise, if we focus on what we're actually afraid is going to happen, I think we'll just be chucked out of the room once more as an alarmist. So in that weird sense, I think being a chance to ridicule the economists for what they've done may be more effective than trying to warn people of what could happen.
Okay, thanks.
And sorry, Stuart, just one additional point. I think it's worth noting here. I mean, Mark Carney, if you look back to his Tragedy of the Horizon speech that was going on 10 years ago, back in 2015, he sort of spoke about the horizons of the financial landscape and how far ahead people in your financial markets would look. We're almost at that kind of 10 years since the speech, and obviously things aren't changing anywhere kind of near enough. I think what you do have in the LGPS in particular is the ability to start thinking about things more like raising issues like intergenerational equity, which is an issue I don't hear near enough about. So what I see in the financial markets, you point out, is this sort of I'll be gone, you'll be gone attitude, where short-termism and the next reward cycle is often what drives decision making. In the pension space, obviously we should be thinking about what's happening 20, 30, 40 years hence when the people working today are going to be retiring. That's just not happening. So in many cases, we're obviously prioritizing the returns over 2 and 3 years over what we're going to see in the future. And I think the more that can be raised and escalated in terms of the balance of priorities amongst the beneficiaries of your schemes, I think the better. But it's just, from what I can see, it's just not happening near enough.
No, I have written to Doug McMurdo, who is head of the local pensions fund. And I raised several points with him about sort of short-term and long-term effects of climate change. There's the recent ruling in the Philippines saying that the fossil fuel companies are responsible for these hurricanes. They ought to form reparations. How dangerous it all is. I'm still waiting for a reply from him. They seem to be totally deaf. And when you do speak to them, they just say, oh, it's the pool that's doing it. It's nothing to do with us.
Yep. We face a challenge there, I think. The key thing is reminding people that deliver engagement activities that they can do some effective things downstream. They just can't here. They're not going to win here. And as a result, they should stop wasting their time. Just because there's been some chat about it in the chat of this question of demonstrating the non-negative financial performance of divestment. I'll just, while some of the answers were going, I find the easiest thing to do is point to index performance and look at so the S&P in the US, comparative 10-year performance, and then take exactly the same thing for the S&P 500, excluding energy companies, as in fossil fuel companies, and you can see that it's outperformed by 200 basis points. So I think the idea that you can make an argument that this has a hugely negative, to the point of blocking you from making any decision, impact is nonsense. I'm going to go to Alex's question for one of our final questions, which is, has anyone produced any suggested language that pension fund people could put into calls for proposals to request proper advice from consultants to prevent pension fund holders from paying for more bad advice from nurses? Or would that be useful for someone to produce? And I think that might be our final question. I'll go to I think Steve or Joel on this one. Joel, I see you've already given a brief answer to this in the chat.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of kind of what can be produced, I think it's a very good idea. We are going to look at producing a policymaker brief with a view to consultation with UK regulatory authorities, be they the Financial Conduct Authority, the pensions regulator, other institutions within the government. So I think that potentially could be adapted and expanded to include things like questions which committee members could be asking about their reliance on investment consultants at the fund. I think there's another set of questions here around procurement, because ultimately these are contracts with an investment consultant that typically the council will go and engage. So there may need to be in future a review of how certain contractual arrangements are kind of let and managed to address this issue. But I think as a starting point, the idea of questions for committees is an excellent one. I think Carbon Track would be happy to input to that.
Thanks so much, Joel. Unless you have anything else to add to that, Steve, I will move to closing thoughts. I'm not seeing any suggestion otherwise, so I will keep us moving. Thank you so much for coming. If you had a question that didn't get asked in the chat, didn't get answered, I'm sorry about that. If you'd like to join us on continuing to discuss this topic and more at the Fossil Free Google group, feel free to message us at ukdivest@gmail.com. That's ukdivest@gmail.com, and we'll make sure to add you to that list where we have hundreds of people across the UK engaged in this conversation and sharing their ideas. Thank you so much for coming. If anybody has any final closing thoughts from our speakers that they really want to desperately share before I close the recording and kick people out, please do so now or forever hold your peace, and welcome all of them for coming, and say thank you so much for their attendance. Thank you so much, everybody. Steve, I think you wanted to say something. Go for it.
Just quickly, please pass those reports around and summarize them to your friends. Let people know just how ridiculous the work is. That's probably the most effective way we can point out that things are much worse than the policymakers believe. So yeah, spread it around, harass journalists who should cover it and don't. Get the media onto it. We need to get this out as widely as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much
for
joining. I'm going to stop
Bye.
the recording now. And